That whore of a wife of yours has 3 husbands. The little girl shrieked, pointing a finger at the millionaire's spouse. Then she brandished 3 marriage certificates, revealing a shocking truth to everyone present. Comment. Rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan had never witnessed such an opulent charity gala. The golden chandeliers cast shimmering light upon the silk gowns of New York's social elite, while men in tuxedos discussed deals between sips of French champagne. Walter Sterling, at 58, observed the crowd of guests he had gathered to raise funds for the city's new children's shelter. As the owner of the largest chain of hardware stores in the region, he understood his social clout was key to the event's success. Dolores Sterling, his wife of 45, mingled with the attendees with the grace that had made her admired in all social circles. Wearing a navy blue dress embroidered with small pearls, she greeted each person with the perfect smile she had cultivated over her 15 years of marriage. No one questioned her dedication to charitable works or her reputation as an exemplary wife. The orchestra had just begun a waltz when the sound of bare feet echoed across the polished marble floor. A small, dirty figure burst through the main doors, causing the security guards to instinctively react. It was a girl of about 4 years old, with tangled brown hair and a torn yellow dress that had seen better days. Her bare feet left streaks of dirt on the spotless floor. "Dolores?" the child cried, her shrill voice cutting through the smooth music like a siren. "Dolores Sterling!" The entire ballroom froze. 400 people stopped talking at once, glasses suspended in mid-air, eyes fixed on the girl, pointing directly at the host's wife. Dolores paled, her hands trembling slightly as she held her crystal glass. "You're my stepmother," the girl continued, running toward Dolores with 3 yellowed papers clutched to her chest. "Daddy Benny said you were married to him too." The murmur that followed was deafening. The society ladies whispered amongst themselves. The men frowned in confusion, and Walter felt the blood drain from his face. Dolores tried to smile, reaching out to the child in a desperate attempt to control the situation. "My dear, you must be confusing me with someone else," she said, her voice trembling imperceptibly. "I don't know any Benny." "Liar!" the girl shouted, waving the papers in the air. "I have the papers here. 3 marriage certificates. One with you being Dolores Simpson, another being Dolores Davis, and this one being Dolores Sterling." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the clinking of silverware or the rustling of silk gowns disturbed the tense atmosphere that had gripped the ballroom. Walter looked at his wife, searching her eyes for some explanation, some sign that this was a bizarre misunderstanding. "Ivy, honey," the girl said, introducing herself with the seriousness of someone much older. "Daddy Benny passed away last month, and Grandma Ginny is very sick. She said I had to find you because you're family." Dolores took a step backward, almost tripping on the hem of her dress. Her eyes darted between the child and the scandalized faces of the guests. The mayor of the city, who had moments before been chatting animatedly about plans for the new hospital, now watched her with an expression of thinly veiled shock. "Walter," Dolores murmured, turning to her husband with pleading eyes, "you have to believe me. I've never seen this child before in my life." But Ivy wasn't finished. With the fierce determination of a 4-year-old who had lost everything, she held out one of the yellowed papers to Walter. "Are you her new husband? Daddy Benny said she liked having lots of husbands." The phrase fell upon the ballroom like a bombshell. Several ladies let out muffled exclamations, hiding their faces behind ornate fans. The men exchanged meaningful glances, and Walter felt as if the floor were opening up beneath his feet. Dr. Rick McMahon, a respected doctor in the city and a close friend of the couple, approached discreetly. "Perhaps it's best to talk in private," he suggested, casting a worried look at the crowd of eager onlookers. "No," Ivy grabbed onto Dolores's skirt. "Grandma Ginny said I couldn't come back without talking to you. She said you had to take care of me because you promised Daddy Benny." Dolores tried to pull away, but the girl held firmly onto the expensive fabric of her dress. Child, you're very confused. I really don't know what you're talking about. But I know about your ring, Ivy exclaimed, pointing to Dolores's left hand. Daddy Benny said you had a ring just like this one, with a little green stone that shines. He said you wore it when you were married to him. Dolores instinctively hid her hand behind her back, but it was too late. Several people had already noticed the emerald ring she always wore, the same one she claimed had been inherited from her late mother. Walter finally found his voice. Dolores, what's going on here? I don't know, she stammered, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. This child must be sick or confused or... I'm not sick, Ivy protested, her tiny voice echoing through the silent ballroom. I just want you to take care of me like you promised Daddy. Grandma Ginny said you were going to give me medicine to make me feel better. The revelation that the child needed medical care added an extra layer of complexity to the already chaotic situation. Walter looked at the thin, pale girl, noticing for the first time the deep circles under her large eyes and the way she was breathing with difficulty. The heavy silence was broken when little Ivy began to cough violently, her fragile body shaking with the effort. Dolores instinctively took a step forward, but stopped midway through the movement, as if fighting against a natural impulse to help. Someone call a doctor, Walter said, his voice cutting through the tension. But his eyes remained fixed on his wife, a silent question burning in his gaze. Who are you, really? The 3 months that followed the charity gala transformed Walter Sterling's life into a waking nightmare. The scandal had spread through Manhattan like wildfire, and everywhere he went, he felt the curious glances and the malicious whispers that followed him. His hardware stores began to lose important customers. Business partners cancelled contracts, and the man who was once respected as a pillar of the community was now seen as the naive husband who had been deceived by a mysterious woman. Dolores had completely withdrawn after that fateful night. She spent weeks locked in the master bedroom of the mansion, only coming out for silent meals where she avoided her husband's gaze. She vehemently denied any knowledge of Benny Simpson or multiple marriages, but her denials sounded increasingly weak and desperate. Little Ivy had been temporarily taken in by Carol Baker, a retired social worker of 67 who had known the Simpson family for decades. It was Carol who brought the first devastating confirmation to Walter. One Tuesday afternoon, she appeared at the door of the mansion with a folder of documents and a grave expression on her wrinkled face. "Mr. Sterling," she said, refusing the coffee he offered, "I need to talk about Benny Simpson and what happened to Ivy." Walter led her to the office, closing the door so that Dolores would not hear the conversation. Carol opened the folder and spread several documents on the polished mahogany desk. "Benny was a good man," she began, her voice filled with sadness. "He worked as an electrician, raising his daughter alone after his wife. After Dolores disappeared 5 years ago." "So it's true," Walter murmured, feeling his stomach churn. "She really was married to him." "Not just married, Mr. Sterling. They lived together for 3 years. Ivy called her mom." Carol passed him a document. "This here is their marriage certificate, dated 2018. And this," she showed another paper, "is Ivy's birth certificate, where Dolores is listed as her adoptive mother." Walter examined the documents with trembling hands. The name was there, clear as day: Dolores Simpson, married to Benny Simpson in a civil ceremony held in Queens. "But how could she have married me if she was already married to him?" Walter asked, his voice almost a whisper. "That's the most disturbing part," Carol replied, pulling more papers from the folder. "We found evidence that she used documents with slightly different names. Dolores Simpson for the marriage to Benny, Dolores Davis for another relationship we discovered in Brooklyn, and Dolores Sterling for the marriage to you." The revelation hit Walter like a punch to the gut. Dolores had taken his last name not just as a matter of marital tradition, but as part of a completely fabricated identity. How many other women had she been? How many other men had been deceived in the same way? "And the child?" he asked, trying to process all the information. "Ivy has a rare medical condition called cystic fibrosis," Carol explained, her expression growing even darker. She needs expensive medication and constant physical therapy. Benny spent almost his entire salary on her treatment. When Dolores disappeared, he had to fend for himself. Walter closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt and anger mixing in his chest. While he lived in luxury with a woman he didn't even know who she really was, a good man had struggled alone to care for a sick child she had abandoned. How did he pass away? Walter asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Heart attack, Carol replied softly. The doctor said it was caused by stress and overwork. He was working 3 jobs to pay for Ivy's treatment. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Walter looked out the window of the office, seeing the manicured lawn of his property, and wondered how many other lives had been destroyed by his wife's secrets. There's more, Carol said, hesitating before continuing. We found bank accounts in the name of Dolores Davis in Brooklyn, considerable amounts that don't seem to have any known origin. How much? Walter asked, though he knew the answer would only make everything worse. Almost $300,000, Mr. Sterling, in 2 different accounts. The revelation of the secret bank accounts was the final blow. Walter realized he knew absolutely nothing about the woman with whom he had shared his bed for 15 years. Every memory, every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, all seemed tainted by lies. That night, he confronted Dolores for the first time since the party. She was sitting on the veranda, looking out at the garden with a blank expression on her face. When she heard his footsteps approaching, she didn't turn around. $300,000, Dolores, he said, his voice controlled but filled with emotion. $300,000 in accounts you kept secret. She finally turned around, and he saw that she had been crying. Her makeup was smudged, revealing an older, more fragile woman than he remembered. Walter, I can explain. Can you explain Benny Simpson too? Can you explain why a 4-year-old child knows you as her mother while you pretended to be my faithful wife? Dolores got up from the chair, reaching out to him in a desperate gesture. My love, you don't understand. My life before you was complicated. I did things I regret, but what I feel for you is real. Real? Walter laughed bitterly. You didn't even tell me your real name. How can anything between us be real? My name is Dolores. She protested, tears streaming down her face. It's always been Dolores. Dolores Simpson? Davis, Sterling. Which one are you really? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Dolores opened and closed her mouth several times, as if struggling to find words that could explain the unexplainable. I don't know anymore, she whispered finally, collapsing back into the chair. Sometimes I get confused myself about who I really am. The confession was more disturbing than any lie could have been. Walter realized he was looking at a woman who had lost control of her own identity, someone who had lied for so long that she could no longer distinguish truth from fiction. And Ivy? He asked, sitting down in the chair next to her. What does she mean to you? Dolores covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She is my daughter, not biologically, but in my heart. Benny was a good man, and I really tried to be a good mother to her. Then why did you run away? Oh, because I'm a coward, she replied, her voice muffled by her hands. Because I always run away when things get tough. When Ivy got sick and the expenses increased, when Benny started asking questions about my past, I panicked. Walter looked at the woman he had loved for 15 years and saw a stranger. Not just because of the secrets she had hidden, but because of the human fragility he had never noticed before. The elegant, confident Dolores he knew was just a mask, a carefully rehearsed performance. What are we going to do now? He asked, though he didn't know if there was still a we to consider. Dolores lifted her face, her red and swollen eyes meeting his. I don't know, she whispered. For the first time in my life, I really don't know. That night, Walter slept in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and wondering if 15 years of his life had been completely based on lies. On the other side of town, in a simple house, little Ivy coughed in her borrowed bed, asking Carol when her mom Dolores was coming to get her. Neither of them knew that the most shocking revelations were still to come. 6 months had passed since the revelation of the secret bank accounts, and Walter had hired Mark Silverman, a discreet private investigator from Albany, to unearth the whole truth about his wife's past. What Mark discovered surpassed even Walter's worst suspicions. One cold morning in August, the investigator arrived at the mansion with a bulky folder and a somber expression on his tanned face. "Mr. Sterling," Mark said, sitting down in the living room and refusing the coffee offered, "what I've found goes beyond bigamy or secret bank accounts. Your wife was operating a much more elaborate scheme than we imagined." Walter felt his stomach clench. In recent months, he had mentally prepared himself for increasingly worse revelations, but something in Mark's tone alerted him that he had not yet hit rock bottom. "The social projects she coordinated," Mark continued, opening the folder. "At least 3 of them were fronts. The St. Vincent's Home for the Elderly, the Winter Clothing Drive, and the Rural Literacy Project all received considerable donations that were diverted to her personal accounts." "How much?" Walter asked, though he knew the answer would only increase his nausea. "In 5 years of operation?" "Approximately $1,200,000, Mark replied, showing bank statements and falsified invoices. "Money that should have helped abandoned elderly people, needy families, and illiterate children." Walter closed his eyes, feeling the weight of shame adding to the anger and despair he already carried. He himself had contributed generously to these projects, proud of his wife's dedication to social causes. Now he discovered that he had financed her crimes against the most vulnerable people in society. "But there's something even more disturbing," Mark said, hesitating before continuing. "The woman you know as Dolores, she's not who you think she is." "What do you mean?" Mark pulled a yellow death certificate from the folder. "The real Dolores Ann Davis passed away in 1998, at 17, in Syracuse, New York. Your wife assumed her identity using documents she obtained through the deceased's family." The silence that followed was deafening. Walter felt as if the floor were dissolving beneath his feet. The woman with whom he had lived for 15 years, with whom he had shared his bed, his dreams, and his fortune, didn't even legally exist. Then who is she really? Brenda Smith, born in 1978 in rural Pennsylvania, daughter of Sue Smith and father unknown, raised in extreme poverty until she was 15 when she disappeared from official records. Mark showed a faded photo of a thin, frightened-looking teenager. "This is the only photo I could find of her as Brenda." Walter took the photo with trembling hands. There was something vaguely familiar about the girl's expression, but it was like looking at a stranger who only resembled his wife. How many layers of lies had she built upon this original identity? "The inheritances she brought into the marriage," Mark continued, "were obtained fraudulently. She pretended to be a distant relative of elderly people without family, using falsified documents to claim inheritances." "My God," Walter murmured. "How many people did she deceive?" "From the records I could find, at least 8 confirmed cases of inheritance fraud. 3 simultaneous marriages, including yours, and countless victims of the false charity schemes." Walter got up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where he had so often seen Dolores, or Brenda, watering the flowers with a serene smile on her face. How could one person build such a perfect facade while destroying lives behind the curtains? "There's more," Mark said softly. "I found medical records of Brenda from when she was 16 years old. She was admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Philadelphia for 3 months. Why? Dissociative identity disorder, multiple personalities resulting from severe childhood trauma." Mark showed an old medical report. According to the records, she created completely different identities to deal with stressful situations. The revelation hit Walter like lightning. Suddenly many things began to make sense. Dolores's sudden mood swings, the way she sometimes seemed to not remember conversations they had had, the moments when she acted like a completely different person. "The doctor who treated her at the time, Dr. Edward Cole, is still alive," Mark said. "I was able to speak to him yesterday. According to him, Brenda created personalities so convincing that she herself believed those different people to be. That means, Walter paused, trying to process the information, that it's possible she genuinely believes she's Dolores. For her, each marriage may have been with a different personality, each identity a real person, separate from the others. Walter returned to the armchair, feeling suddenly exhausted. If this were true, it meant that Dolores, or Brenda, wasn't simply a calculating criminal, but a deeply disturbed woman who had lost control of her own mind. And Ivy? What do we know about her relationship with the child? That's perhaps the only genuine aspect of all this, Mark replied, his expression softening slightly. From the reports I got from neighbors and acquaintances of Benny, she truly loved Ivy as a daughter. She spent hours caring for the child, taking her to medical appointments, always there when Ivy needed physical therapy. Then why did she run away? According to Dr. Cole, people with this type of disorder often flee when they feel their current identity is being threatened. If Benny started asking questions about her past, it may have triggered a crisis that forced her to switch personalities. Walter thought of the woman he had found crying on the veranda months ago, confused about who she really was. Perhaps that was a rare moment of clarity, when all the personalities overlapped and she saw the truth of her situation. That afternoon, Walter visited Ivy for the first time since the party. The girl was playing in Carol's backyard, building sandcastles with the meticulous patience of someone who had learned to find joy in simple things. When she saw Walter approaching, she smiled shyly. "You're my mother Dolores's husband," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I am," Walter replied, crouching down to her level. "How are you feeling, Ivy?" "I'm fine, and Carol is very nice to me." The girl paused, her large eyes becoming sad. "But I miss my mom. Why doesn't she come to see me?" The simple and honest question broke Walter's heart. How to explain to a 4-year-old child that the person she considered her mother was lost in a labyrinth of false identities and unresolved traumas? "She's sick," he said finally. "She's trying to get better. Sick like me?" Ivy asked, touching her own chest where she knew her lungs were fighting cystic fibrosis. "Different from you. Sick in her heart and mind." Ivy nodded with the seriousness of someone who knew suffering well. "Daddy Benny was sick in his heart too, especially after Mommy left. He cried a lot at night." The child's words echoed in Walter's mind, all the way back home. How many other people had suffered because of Brenda's untreated mental problems? How many lives had been destroyed by someone who may not even have had complete control over their actions? When he got home, he found Dolores, he still thought of her by that name, sitting at the piano in the living room, playing a melancholic melody he didn't recognize. She didn't stop playing when he came in, but her hands trembled slightly on the keys. "Brenda," he said softly. Her hands froze on the keyboard. Slowly, she turned to look at him, and in her eyes was a mixture of fear, confusion, and something that looked like relief. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Does it matter?" She shook her head, tears beginning to stream down her face. "Sometimes I don't know who I am anymore, Walter. I wake up in the morning and for a moment I don't know if I'm Dolores or Brenda or one of the others." "Others?" "There's Cindy, who was married to Bob in Brooklyn, and Fran, who lived alone in the Upper West Side for 2 years, and—" She paused, bringing her hands to her head. "Sometimes they all talk at the same time in my head." Walter approached slowly, as if dealing with an injured animal. For the first time in months, he felt genuine compassion for her, mixed with horror at what he had discovered about her mental condition. "Do you remember being treated by a doctor when you were young?" Brenda, because now he knew that was her real name, nodded slowly. "Dr. Cole. He tried to help me, but I ran away from the clinic. I was very scared. Ivy asked about you today," Walter said, watching her reaction. The effect was instantaneous. Brenda doubled over, sobbing as if all the pain in the world had collapsed on her at once. "My baby," she murmured between sobs. "My sick girl. I promised to take care of her forever, and I ran away as I always do." "She still loves you," Walter said, surprising himself with his own gentleness. "She calls you Mom." Brenda lifted her face, her desperate eyes meeting his. "Do you think she can forgive me? Do you think it's possible to fix at least this?" Walter looked at the woman who had destroyed his life, who had deceived dozens of people, who had stolen money intended for the needy. But he also saw a deeply sick person, lost in her own fragmented mind, struggling to find some piece of real humanity amid the chaos of her false identities. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But maybe it's time we tried to find out who you really are beneath all those masks." That night, while Brenda slept sedated by medication that Dr. McMahon had prescribed, Walter remained awake, knowing that the decision he made in the coming weeks would define not only her future, but also the fate of an innocent child who desperately needed medical care and maternal love. The greatest revelation was yet to come, but for now he tried to find strength to face the most frightening truth of all, that he might still love the real woman hidden behind all those lies. 18 months after the party that changed their lives forever, Walter was sitting in the waiting room of the St. Francis Neuropsychiatric Clinic in Philadelphia. It'd been a long road, filled with intense therapeutic sessions, devastating emotional crises, and moments of fragile hope that alternated with episodes of deep despair. Brenda had undergone an experimental treatment developed by Dr. Edward Cole, now 73, who had agreed to take care of the patient he had lost decades ago again. The process of integrating the multiple personalities had been more complex and painful than anyone had imagined. During the first few months, Brenda alternated between her different identities several times a day, each with distinct memories, mannerisms, and even food preferences. Walter had witnessed conversations between Dolores, Cindy, and Fran, watching in horror as his wife argued with herself about events that each personality remembered differently. But the greatest revelation had come during a particularly intense session 6 months ago, when Dr. Cole managed to access Brenda's deepest memories. What they discovered completely changed their understanding of her condition and the events that had led to the development of her multiple personalities. Brenda had been systematically abused by her stepfather between the ages of 8 and 15. To survive the traumas psychologically, her mind had created different personalities that took over during the episodes of violence, protecting her true essence from an unbearable reality. Each personality had been developed with a specific function. Dolores was the perfect wife who could please men and achieve financial security. Cindy was the independent woman who didn't need anyone. Fran was the survivor who knew how to hide and disappear when necessary. "What your wife did was not calculated or malicious," Dr. Cole had explained to Walter in a private meeting. Each personality genuinely believed they were doing the best to protect Brenda. Dolores really loved you and believed she was married only to you. Cindy really loved Bob in Brooklyn. For them, there was no inconsistency because they were different people. The understanding had brought relief and horror in equal measure. Walter finally understood why Dolores always seemed genuine in her feelings, because they were genuine. But it also meant that dozens of people had been harmed by someone who didn't even have full awareness of her actions. The treatment had required enormous sacrifices from everyone involved. Walter had sold 2 of his stores to pay for the private clinic and the experimental medications. His reputation in the city would never fully recover, but he had learned to value inner peace above social approval. Carol had continued to care for Ivy throughout the process, and the girl had become the emotional center around which everyone else revolved. Ivy had visited Brenda at the clinic once a week throughout the treatment. In the beginning, the visits were confusing and painful, with the child trying to understand why her mother sometimes recognized her, and other times seemed not to know who she was. But gradually, as the treatment progressed, something beautiful began to emerge from this fragmented relationship. The integrated Brenda, who emerged from the therapy sessions, remembered all the moments she had lived with Ivy, but now understood them as a complete and continuous experience, not as memories of a separate personality. The maternal love that Dolores had felt for the girl was really there, buried under layers of trauma and dissociation. On that particular morning, Walter was waiting for what Dr. Cole had called the final assessment session. After 18 months of intensive treatment, Brenda had managed to fully integrate her multiple personalities. There was no more Dolores, Cindy, or Fran, just Brenda Smith, a 47-year-old woman who finally knew her own complete story and was ready to take responsibility for all the actions that her personalities had committed. "Mr. Sterling?" the nurse called. "Dr. Cole can see you now." Walter entered the familiar office where he had spent countless hours in recent months trying to understand the woman he loved. Brenda was sitting in her usual armchair, but there was something fundamentally different about her. Her eyes had a clarity he hadn't seen in years, a complete presence that all the fragmented personalities had never been able to achieve. "Hi, Walter," she said, and even her voice sounded different, deeper, more real, without the subtle artificiality that had always permeated Dolores's speech. "How are you feeling?" he asked, sitting down in the chair next to her. "Whole," Brenda replied, and the word carried the weight of an epic journey. "For the first time in my adult life, I feel whole." Dr. Cole watched the interaction with professional satisfaction. "Brenda has achieved something remarkable," he said. "Not only has she integrated her personalities, but she has also completely processed the traumas that caused the initial fragmentation. She is, in every medical sense, cured." "And legally?" Walter asked, though he knew this conversation was inevitable. "I will take responsibility for everything," Brenda said firmly. "We will return all the money that can be traced. I will collaborate with the authorities to identify all the victims of the fraud schemes, and I accept any legal consequences of my actions." "Your actions?" Walter gently corrected her. "You said you now understand that they were different personalities." "They were part of me," Brenda replied, her voice filled with painful maturity. "I can't hide behind the illness to avoid responsibility. People were harmed, Walter. Families lost money that was meant to help those in need. You had your life turned upside down. Benny." Her voice broke slightly as she mentioned the name of the man she had loved with one of her personalities. "Benny loved Dolores," Walter said. "And Dolores loved him too. That was real. It was real for her, but she was part of a sick person who couldn't maintain stable relationships," Brenda replied. "The end result was that a good man spent the last years of his life raising a sick child alone because the woman he loved disappeared without explanation." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had finally reached the bottom of a deep and painful truth. "What about us?" Walter asked, the question he had avoided for months finally leaving his lips. Brenda looked at him with a tenderness he hadn't seen since the early years of his marriage to Dolores. "I remember every moment that Dolores lived with you," she said. "Every conversation, every gesture of affection, every night we spent together. And I know that she really loved you, Walter. Just like I love you now. But I also remember every lie she told, every document she falsified, every person she deceived to maintain the illusion of our perfect life. How can you love me knowing all that?" Walter brought his hands to his face, feeling the weight of 18 months of reflection and emotional growth. "Because I've learned the difference between loving a perfect person and loving a real person," he said finally. "Dolores was a perfect illusion. You are a real person, with scars and flaws and a terrible history. But you are real." Dr. Cole stood up discreetly. "I'll leave you to talk in private," he said. "But before I go, I want you to know that you have both demonstrated extraordinary emotional strength. What you have managed to overcome together is rare and precious." After the doctor left, Walter and Brenda were alone in the office, looking at each other as if they were seeing each other for the first time, which, in a way, was true. "Ivy has forgiven you," Walter said. "Last week, when you explained to her about your illness and why you had to leave, she said she understood. She said she also gets confused sometimes when she has severe breathing attacks." Brenda smiled through tears. Children have a capacity for forgiveness that we adults have lost. Carol wants to talk to you about the possibility of Ivy coming to live with us, Walter continued. If you want, of course. If you think you can be the mother she needs. I want to try, Brenda replied, but only if you're sure. Ivy has suffered enough abandonment. If we start this journey together, it has to be forever. Walter got up and held out his hand to him. Well, then let's go home, he said. Let's go get our daughter. 3 months later, on a sunny December morning, Walter was in his backyard watching Brenda teach Ivy how to plant roses in the garden. The girl, now 6 years old, and with her medical condition stabilized thanks to proper treatment, laughed as she tried to dig a hole too small for the seedling. Life hadn't returned to normal. It had become something completely new. Brenda worked as a volunteer at a support center for abuse victims, using her experience to help other women struggling with similar traumas. Walter had rebuilt his business, focusing on genuine social projects, discovering that he found more satisfaction in helping underserved communities than in simply accumulating wealth. They had remarried in a small and intimate ceremony, with Brenda using her real name and her real identity. Ivy had been the flower girl, carrying a bouquet of flowers she had chosen herself. The society of Manhattan had never completely accepted them back, but they had found a new community among other families who understood that true love sometimes requires forgiveness for deep wounds. Brenda had served a community service sentence for her frauds, but none of the victims had pressed for more severe punishments when they understood the nature of her mental condition. "Daddy Walter," Ivy called, interrupting his reflections. "Mom Brenda said I can plant a giant sunflower here." Walter smiled, watching how Brenda patiently helped the girl position the seed in the prepared soil. There was something deeply healing in seeing these two people who had suffered so much finding joy in simple acts of creation and care. "Of course, Princess," he replied, joining them in the garden. "But remember that sunflowers need a lot of love and patience to grow," Ivy nodded solemnly. "Just like people," she said, with the precocious wisdom of someone who had learned about healing and growth through her own experience. As the three worked together in the garden, planting seeds that would bloom in the spring, Walter realized that he had found something he didn't know he was looking for: a real, imperfect and precious family, built not on comfortable lies, but on difficult truths and unconditional love. Little Ivy, who had burst into their lives carrying documents that exposed a world of secrets, had become the catalyst that forced them to confront their deepest truths. And in the end, that confrontation had revealed not destruction, but possibility, the possibility of starting over, this time with complete honesty about who they really were and what they really wanted to build together. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.